I'm Amy Baxter, editor of Retail Leader, and welcome to Trend Talk. Every week on Trend Talk, we identify a retail trend and give it a deep dive with an industry insider. This week, we're looking at some of the latest retail real estate trends, and specifically, we're looking at how retailers are working with their landlords to stay open during one of the most trying times thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. With me today is Beth Radischel, real estate partner at Neil Gerber Eisenberg, which advises stakeholders in the retail and hospitality industries on their real estate needs. So, hi, Beth. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I'm wondering if first you could give me an overview of what retailers and landlords have been facing over the last 15, 16 months when it comes to leases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, everyone's been facing a lot, right? But yeah, and I come at this from the perspective mostly of representing landlords more than tenants. But that being said, we've seen a really good sample set of, what folks are asking for and really what those responses have been from the landlords. But I think the biggest one thing to just focus on is by and large the most significant issue, which isn't overly complicated, but how people are just going to pay their rent day to day and keep their doors open, or if they can't keep their doors open, what they're going to do about this. So, in terms of negotiating lease amendments, by and large, there's been really two ways that folks are dealing with this. The first option being rent abatements, which is essentially where the tenant gets some free period of rent, but they don't have to pay it back. And the second option being rent deferrals, which is really saying, look, we know you can't pay now, but we know you will hopefully have the prospect of paying in the future. And once you start making money again. And, we've seen this structured in so many different ways, from installment payments to like combos of the two of them. And it really, really is not a one size fits all approach. Depending on the situation, there's different arrangements that people have been struggling with on whether do I keep paying my utilities? Do I keep paying my maintenance? And what if I have outstanding tenant improvement allowance? A lot of times landlords are looking for that to kind of be applied first. So there's lots of situations, but I mean, the big overview of the last 18 months is just how I pay my rent and how I get there with my landlord, which is something I'm sure we'll touch on.
Yeah. What's been the reception from landlords? How willing have they been to work with retailers as they're going through this sort of unprecedented era?
Yeah. I mean, and I think in my experience, at least, the short answer is they've been really willing to work with them. And again, my experience is limited to what I've been seeing, but I think that there's really a lot of good reasons why they want to work and play nice in the sandbox. And everyone has their own reasons, but there's really three main ones that I think it kind of boils down to. The first is really just the straight up practical answer of it's in a landlord's best interest to keep their building tenanted, right? So if that means that they need to give a tenant a little bit of help, so long as there's a good probability that that tenant's going to be able to pay in the future, which is some of the points we can touch on, it makes sense to listen to them instead of dealing with the time and the hassle to try to find a new tenant, lease up the space, especially right now, because that's uncertain in itself. The second, which is also kind of a more practical answer, is really tied to landlords' ability to get some flexibility on horse trading for things that they might need. So, it's not just retailers who are looking for things and struggling right now. One thing that we're seeing landlords insist upon kind of in exchange for relief are greater transparency. That's huge. Although landlords are willing to work with their tenants, they really want to know that the tenants are sincere in their inability to pay. So things like, more financial statement disclosures on a more regular basis, those are kind of things that we've been working in the lease amendments that tenants should be prepared for when they go into these discussions. Another thing is adding term as a trade, especially for tenants who landlords want to keep around, right? These people who they know they're having trouble right now, but this is a great tenant. This is somebody who 5 years from now, we want them to be here. So maybe they'll add a few years on their lease and say, guys, we want this relationship to work. So let's talk about that. And then something else that I think they're horse trading is waiving co-tenancy requirements, which we see it less and less, but I do think there are still a lot of leases where landlords are kind of beholden to keeping the neighbors open. And if that doesn't happen, they can get hurt. So they've been, asking for that if it exists as kind of a horse trade in order to get the tenants comfortable on their rent. And then the last thing I'll quickly touch on and I am a lawyer, so I have to touch on the legal risk aversion rationale, but despite being a lawyer, I think, and I hope that there's still a fundamental understanding it's probably better to avoid litigation if you can. I don't tell my litigation colleagues I say that, but in a lot of these cases, COVID, nobody knows what's going to happen with COVID. And although courts are starting to shake out on things like interpreting force majeure clauses and, whether there are legal excuses to perform, like frustration of purpose, all those fun doctrines, we don't really know. And I think, at least in the case of most of my clients, nobody wants to be the test case. So, you look to your lawyers for certainty. I'm like, what are my chances if I had to fight with this tenant as opposed to playing nice in the sandbox? And it's hard to know what those chances look like. So I think by and large, people would rather, in this unclear legal landscape, really just find a reasonable solution.
Yeah, super interesting. So for the transparency negotiations, is that the first time you've seen something like that come up in these leases? And is it short term? Like, do they have to present every month, how much they're
Yeah, and it kind of depends, and I think a lot depends on the relationship and what exactly kind of relief people are looking for. I mean, in some instances, people just need a month, right? But in some
Mhm.
instances, it's been a lot longer. And in terms of helping, figuring out retailers and how to navigate this too, I think that it really depends. It's not uncommon for things like financial reporting to be found in leases. I think here the difference is landlords really just need tenants to open their books to actually prove their case. Typically that's an underwriting exercise at the beginning of things. You look at it and you figure it out, and then maybe there are reporting. But here you don't want the point of all of these discussions and playing nice in the sandbox is to avoid anyone really getting a windfall and to just try to find a reasonable solution that works for folks. So, you need to kind of have that reassurance that folks aren't suddenly starting to perform super well or coming into other sources of funding. We've had to think about things like business interruption proceeds, or even if tenants are qualifying for governmental loans and stuff that suddenly make them looking a lot better financially. Those are the kind of things that really just are causing that need for transparency, and really so landlords can also prove to their lenders that they have, a reason to be doing this.
Yeah. So I know you mostly deal on the landlord side, but from the retailer side, how should retailers be thinking as they kind of go into these renegotiations, and, what are the risks for the retailers as they make other changes like long-term leases and such?
Yeah, I mean, I think it first of all helps for everybody to, I've always believed in being nice, right? But like, I think it helps to go into it with a sort of empathy towards both sides. I often think landlords get less of it, but I mentioned this just briefly a little bit ago, but we have to remember that landlords are responsible to folks as well. And I think it's important for retailers to remember that, landlords are beholden to their lenders, and they have somebody to answer to too. So keeping that in mind when you go into this and these types of negotiations, and remembering that we just need it to work, it is, as opposed to somebody winning, I think is a really good approach. Typically if a landlord has a mortgage lender, they'll probably need to go to them to get their consent to whatever it is that they're doing with this tenant, especially if it's a somewhat big relief that they're offering. Challenge there is that a lot of lenders don't have the same risk analysis profile that a landlord might. So even if they're willing to do something, if their lender isn't, it gets tough. And that's where that transparency gets even more important. And, I think advising retailers to be prepared for that transparency is important, because even if the landlord said, I trust you, their lender might not. And opening those books and proving that case, I think is really important.
Right. And so how have you been advising your clients to navigate through these conditions? And I guess what's your best advice to anybody, if it's just being pathetic or anything beyond?
Yeah, and this is maybe the most cliche, but best advice is it's not, or best advice is it's not a one size fits all approach. Even amongst the same landlords and the same tenants. I mean, something that we've all seen and been dealing with is, COVID is not hitting states and municipalities the same. It's happening in different ways in different places. So, just because retailer X and landlord X have a relationship in their New York store that they've worked out, that doesn't mean that the same is going to happen at their store in Texas, maybe even if it's the same exact parties. And, so being nimble and flexible and really having to take it on a case by case, everybody wants the easy way. Everybody wants to do a form that'll work for 20 different relationships. And it just doesn't. So, really being thoughtful and figuring out what really works. And that ties into, the other stakeholders and making sure that they're on board. Because I think if everybody if you get it sort of right, it'll be a lot easier to convince people of that. The other thing that I know we've been advising our clients, but they're actually focused on too, and this kind of comes from both sides, is normally this is it's in every document. Usually the lawyers care and some people don't, but the increased emphasis on confidentiality, and it kind of ties to that same point. You know, there's always those provisions in there, but really here people are thinking about it a lot because, you know, certainly a landlord has different relationships with their tenants and a tenant has different relationships at their store that's down the street, right? And I think that landlords, it behooves them to really kind of keep those confidentiality, discussions really confidential, definitely confidential, so that word doesn't get out that they're giving one tenant relief and then somebody else wants it when maybe they don't need it, or vice versa for tenants. They're working with one landlord and can pay them fully because that store is doing really well when another isn't. So again, that's in line with the not one size fits all, but also just keeping that perspective of needing to be thoughtful in terms of that too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I always like to end on a look forward question. So I want to ask you how, if the pandemic related struggles that retailers have faced have long-term implications for real estate, and, if anything, what's likely to change over the next couple of years?
Yes. I mean, I hope and you tell me, but no, to be totally frank, I mean, time will tell. I don't know. I mean, what I do think, and what I think, if we want to put a silver lining on all of this, is that, people are learning to be very nimble. And I think the retail industry in general already kind of was learning that, I think even before COVID. They had to, for lack of a better term, be creative to start coming up with ways to work in a new retail landscape and evolve as things are changing. And, for what it's worth, I do think that pandemic related struggles haven't just hit brick and mortar retail either. I mean, we've seen the challenges that delivery retail has had with supply chain things too. So I think everybody's kind of learning on the fly. And so, while I'd love to talk about the long-term implications, I'm not really totally sure, but I think that the takeaway long-term is maybe more of one of strategy. And that's, if we all keep focusing on trying to be practical, transparent, and really just nimble, and maybe trying to just get the right answer or feels kind of right for everybody, as opposed to just adversarial, hopefully we'll find a way to work it out in most situations and avoid too many things from going wrong.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much, Beth, for joining me. The retail industry has obviously faced, so many challenges over the last year and a half, and it's good to hear that there are options and that there are solutions happening in the real estate sector.
Absolutely. It was so great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. Well, that's all the time we have this week for Trend Talk, and we'll see you back here next week with another retail trend.